Are live on Monday night, 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time with Matthew Pose. How you doing, my friend?
I'm good. I'm using my new camera.
I know you look great.
Yeah, I'd
Thank
love
you.
to hear some comments from others to find out if this is worth the effort.
Awesome. Well, we still have a limitation with the streaming program, so you're not going to see the full benefits of your camera. And obviously, this is the best quality we're going to do for streaming wise in order to have multiple people on and to make it easy for us. So, guys, please be kind about that. We're here to bring you a message. And tonight's message we're going to talk about is room acoustics. I know we always mention that the importance of room acoustics, but we've been doing lots of videos on other topics. And I think it's time we spend a little time on room acoustics. And that's why I asked Matthew to be a guest here, because Matthew's got a ton of experience with this. He does this for a living. He does consulting for people to design home theater systems, all centered around getting the best room you can before you put that equipment in. Because let's face it, if you start out and you get all this great equipment and you're putting it in a room that's got glass walls, tile floors, and it sounds like an echo chamber, it doesn't matter how much you spend on equipment, it's not going to sound good. So it's really important to get your listening space to sound reasonably well, something not too anechoic. You don't want the thing to sound so dead that it becomes uncomfortable to have a conversation in. So, Matt, I want you to drop a bunch of knowledge on us. I want to talk about, early reflections, the benefits of early reflections, how to treat the sidewalls. I want to talk about how to treat the ceiling. I want to talk about, how to deal with bass, whether you use multiple subs or you use bass traps. And I want to talk, I think we should define some basic terms. I keep seeing this question popping up. What is the room transition frequency? Because we always refer to the room transition frequency, especially when we're talking about doing active equalization on the system. We always say minimize your EQ above the room transition frequency, apply that EQ below the room transition frequency at base. So why don't you define for people that are asking, what is the room transition frequency?
Sure. So the room transition frequency, which is also often referred to as the room's FS, or the room's Schroeder frequency, which is because Schroeder is the one who came up with the mathematical model and concept for this, refers to a point in a room where it transitions from what we call modal to stochastic. So, okay, what does that mean? That's kind of jargony. Modal is actually something we talk a lot about, and I'm hoping most of our audience knows what that is. Basically, that's a point at which there's reflections from the low frequencies. Modal is a low frequency region where you see distinct peaks and dips in the response. So what's happening is that the sound wave from the, let's say, subwoofer or main speakers is going out, it's hitting a wall, it's coming back, and it's interfering with the sound where you're sitting. And that causes this peak or dip. The modal region is a place where that's happening with such wide spacing that you can clearly see those peaks and dips. And you hear them too. They're big and very dramatic. The stochastic region is a point where basically what's happened is the modes or these reflection interferences have become so close together, you can't see them anymore. Not only can you not see them, but you can't really, if you took a measurement once and you took that same measurement 1 second later and you compared the two, they won't be exactly the same. Because at this point, the modes are so small, so fine, and so close together that actually they move with space and time. So we call it stochastic because it's a statistical zone. It's a point where you can predict what these reflection interferences are going to look like, but at any point in time, they may change slightly.
So is that part of the reason why it's difficult to EQ at high frequencies?
Yes, but there's a bigger reason. So the biggest reason really is this. At low frequencies, those big, distinct modal peaks and dips that you measure with a omnidirectional measurement microphone is pretty similar to what you hear. You hear those peaks and dips basically the way you see them. At mid and high frequencies, where we get into this stochastic zone, what you're measuring on an omnidirectional microphone, no matter how many measurement points you take throughout the room, doesn't match what your ears hear. And the reason is because your ears have a different directivity than that mic does. You have two of them, and they're in different locations. And more importantly, your brain is able to actually filter some of the reflections out. So what you hear and what you measure is a combination of the direct sound from the speakers as well as all the reflections. But your brain actually filters a lot of those reflections out at mid and high frequencies above the transition zone. It doesn't really filter them out at low frequencies. The microphone doesn't filter anything out. It captures all of it. So what the mic shows you is not what you hear.
Yeah, because it's just a sum of all the sound in the room.
Exactly. It's the total energy. And because of that, if you EQ it based on what you measured with the mic, it's not going to match what you hear.
And that's kind of scary because you can get, and we're kind of going off topic talking about EQ, but it is kind of related to room acoustics. You'll get these companies that will do these EQ systems and they'll make assumptions based on the total sound that's in the room at that mic position. And if the speaker is a well-behaved speaker with good uniform off-axis response versus a speaker that has bad off-axis response, there's no way that room correction system is going to make any type of any type of distinction between a good speaker and a bad speaker in that case.
You're right. One of the risks with a lot of room correction systems that do what we call full bandwidth correction, they go all the way up into the high frequencies, is that they'll make corrections based on faulty assumptions. And one of the biggest faulty assumptions is that it basically assumes the speaker has a smooth off-axis response. A lot of speakers don't, especially older speakers. And as a result of that, it makes corrections for that off-axis response, even though your brain isn't hearing it.
Right. So now someone's asking, what is considered a small room? And to me, I've always considered a small room where the dimensions are shorter than the lowest bass wave. I mean, that's kind of like a swag for me. So 20 hertz is about 50 or 60 feet, right?
Yeah, if any of the dimensions of the room typically fall below roughly, so basically a small room is any room you live in. All domestic spaces are almost always, unless you're the absolute richest person in the world with an insane home, are almost always considered small room acoustically. And the reason is because at least one of the dimensions is usually less than 50 or 60 feet. And as a result, there's a modal reflection. So small room basically is defined as still having visible modal reflections.
Right. So somebody's asking this question here. So a room with a high transition frequency is better, and can acoustic treatments raise a transition frequency?
They actually do the opposite. They lower the transition frequency. So the more absorption that you put in a room, the more of that reverberation you take out, the lower the transition frequency. I wouldn't say a higher transition frequency is better. It just is a property of the room.
And I would caution people to, and I've said this on many videos before, and I get some heat from these acoustic companies that watch our YouTube channel. I caution people not to overtreat a room. I can't tell you how many CEDIA demos I've been to where they went in and they had acoustic companies go in and just shove absorption everywhere. And you walk in there and it sounds like you're in an anechoic chamber. There's no natural sense of space. When you walk into a room and you can't sense the space of the room, I think you've went too far. And I think part of the reason why this happens is you'll get acoustic companies that'll consult with you and say, hey, we're going to do XYZ to your room. But they don't factor in the fact that you're going to have couches in there. You're going to have other sorts of furniture, whatever. You have bookcases, you have curtains. I think a room should not really be treated until you know what's going to be inside that space. Otherwise, you risk the chance of over-absorbing and just killing. Some of those reflections are very beneficial for spaciousness. And if you kill all of that, you're basically listening anechoic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think actually Floyd Toole has made a point about this that we have in one of the articles he wrote for us that a lot of people, I think, have unfortunately misunderstood. What he basically says is that most rooms have naturally enough acoustic treatment in them that they don't need a lot of extra treatment added. And what he means by that is that the pictures on the wall, the couch, the carpet, the curtains, all provide enough absorption, diffusion, and what's called scattering, which is kind of a non-mathematical form of diffusion. So basically the sound is being still spread out all over the place, though. That happens naturally in a room well enough that you don't really need to add a lot more. And why does he say that? Because if you measure a room and you look at its decay time, most small acoustic spaces, basically most domestic rooms, actually have a relatively flat and relatively low RT60 time, or relatively low reverberant decay time. And so what that means is the room is acoustically pretty okay. You don't need to add a lot more. And that's coming from somebody who sells people acoustic treatments.
Right. Yeah. And it really, you have to look at what that speaker is doing as well. If you're purposely, if you're designing, or if you're buying a speaker that goes out of its way to control its dispersion characteristics and give you uniform off-axis characteristics based on what's coming out of the front of the speaker as well, then you don't necessarily want to squish those reflections, because those reflections to some point can be beneficial if the speaker's not too close to a wall and those reflections are too strong, obviously.
Yeah, so speakers have different directivity, and how you treat a room, especially at mid and high frequencies, depends a lot on the speaker's directivity, and that's what you're getting at. So if a speaker's directivity, I don't want to call it narrow, because I feel like anytime I say that, people misinterpret that to mean that it's literally projecting like a laser beam of sound. That isn't really what it means. But
Right.
if the dispersion is controlled such that it naturally gets quieter off to the sides, then if you aim the speaker at the listener, which is something you should be doing anyway, that's called towing in, the sound that hits the wall is already quieter. So it does the same thing that putting a treatment on the wall would do, but it's got one big benefit. Most acoustic treatments on the wall don't absorb evenly. Their absorption coefficients might look like they do, but they don't really. And so the reflections that come back into the wall after they hit that panel, and this is actually a myth people should understand, just because an acoustic panel has a noise reduction coefficient of 1, suggesting that it absorbs 100% of the sound that hit it, doesn't actually mean it literally absorbed 100% of the sound. There's still a very strong sound wave that bounces back off that panel. Basically goes through the panel, hits the wall, and comes back. It's reduced in level enough to give that high NRC rating, but it's not actually 0. And so...
Well, the other thing I was going to say too is if you fabric wrap your absorption, that's going to reduce its ability to absorb as well. It becomes almost like a reflector, right?
It can, yes. And again, Floyd Toole in his book, and I think in our article, has a measurement of this. And when I saw that, I remember thinking, well, maybe that's because he was measuring a 2-inch panel. I'm going to try this with a 4-inch panel. And actually, our own James Larson and I became friends when I was in the midst of this crazy experiment, because it's very hard without proper chambers to measure this stuff. So I set up a rig to measure the reflection off of a acoustic panel, and I tested a 2-inch panel and a 4-inch panel. And I was able to confirm that, yes, adding fabric caused some reflections at high frequencies, and that the response of that reflection was anything but flat. So back to the point of this, a speaker that actually has very uniform response off axis that tends to get quieter, so it's got what's called controlled dispersion, what we would sometimes call narrow directivity, does basically the same thing you expect an acoustic panel to do, but it does a better job. And it allows you to get away with no panels on the wall.
So in that case, what do you do on the wall? You just leave what your natural, what your wall decorations are, or if you have curtains or anything like that, right?
Well, curtains are absorbers. So actually a curtain's the same as putting a panel on the wall. You would have nothing. You would just have a bare wall. You could put pictures that would actually scatter some sound, and that's not a horrible thing. But ideally in that scenario, at the first reflection point, you would just have a bare wall. You could have a wood panel if you want to have something that looks prettier.
And I think it's important to stress symmetry when you're dealing with your front primary speakers. This is more, in my opinion, it's more important that you get your symmetry correct with your front 3 LCRs, even more so than your surround speakers. But whatever you're doing with your left front speaker, you should be doing the same thing with your right front speaker. You should have equal distance, if you can, between each of those speakers and their respective sidewalls.
You're right. And one of the common things that people face is that they've got their front speakers, and on one side of the wall, they've got a big window with curtains. And on the other side of the wall usually is open to something, the kitchen, let's say. And people often are like, I don't have symmetry, I don't know what to do. Actually, you might. The right side with no wall that I was just talking about that opens to the kitchen is the same as essentially having a giant absorber.
Right.
The left side that has that window, as I mentioned, has a curtain. That curtain is a big absorber too, but it may not be a great absorber. So what you might do is put in heavier curtains, or you can actually add like a felt inner lining into the curtain behind it. And so basically what I would recommend to people in those scenarios is that they create acoustic symmetry by closing the curtains and making sure that the curtains are as absorbent as possible to match that right side.
Yeah, and I'll show, just so people could see, a very basic illustration. This is from a long time ago, but I still have this article. Back when I designed the theater room in my existing house, this is at the very beginning stages. You could see do you see my screen?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so in my room, it was an L-shaped room. I don't have this hockey table anymore. That's long gone. I have a drum set here now. But anyways, let's just call these my front speakers. You can see that this area here is more open because of the L shape, so the dimensions aren't perfect. So I put a lot of absorption here to kind of like do what you say, to offset the fact that there's no wall here. Now, once I got all the furniture in this room, it got too dead because there was a lot of absorption on this wall. There was absorption here. It didn't sound natural to me. So in order to bring some balance back to the room, I basically changed my floors, believe it or not. I put hardwood floors here, and then I threw a thick padded rug at the first reflection points. And then the room sounded a little bit more balanced. It didn't, you could actually have a conversation in here, and it didn't sound like I was, in some type of a test lab. So I just wanted to point out that I kind of did the same thing. I put absorption here, and then when I measured when I measured at the microphone right at the sweet spot here, these speakers are actually, they track pretty well out to almost 20 kilohertz. I was surprised that I got enough balance, even though the symmetry wasn't perfect in the walls, just by playing around with the amount of absorption and then putting some curtains here to kind of break that up a little bit. It actually worked out pretty well.
Yeah, you have a well-treated room.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously I had help. I had help with Audioholics helping me on that. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing the screen. Okay, sorry about that. But yeah, I did. I was fortunate enough that I had an acoustics company come out and help design this room to make it more palatable than it was when I moved in, when it was just all drywall. But and most people don't have perfect rectangular rooms, so you have to kind of adapt to those situations and do what's right in each particular situation.
Yeah, and I usually tell people to try to create acoustic symmetry when you don't have physical symmetry. So I even in my theater, you can sort of see it blurred out in the background there, have a closet. The back of my room is not symmetric. Now in the back of the room, I don't consider symmetry to be as important as in the front of the room. So I didn't really do anything about that. But what you might do is put some absorbers, for instance, on the walls of the closet on the outside there, which helps the closet to essentially acoustically disappear. And if you have like a closet on one side of the room in your house, for instance, you can do something similar to that. You can put curtains on the wall. I've actually seen people do that. You don't need to have windows to put curtains up, and it's one of the cheapest acoustic treatments you can get. You just space them out from the wall. So up on your wall there, you just put some curtain hangers, and you get some nice heavy curtains made of like canvas or velvet or something like that. And you run them along the whole wall. And then when you listen to music, you close up the curtains. And one of the neat things about curtains, just as a sort of a cheap trick for people, is you can open and close them in different locations if you use different panels, which allows you to change how reflective versus absorbent the room is.
Yeah, exactly. And that also, you could do that depending on the kind of music you're listening to. Or another important factor people don't always consider is how many speakers do you have playing in a room? Because whether you have 2 speakers playing in a room or whether you have multiple speakers playing in a room also changes what you might do acoustically to that room. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so basically the reason why you want a room to be a little bit lively is that for the most part, for a very long time now, we have been stuck with 2 speakers. And we call it stereo sound. Now, technically, stereo sound can be multiple speakers, more than 2, but we typically refer to more than 2 as being surround sound. So stereo sound uses 2 speakers, and those 2 speakers, in and of themselves, are not actually able to create discretely the reverberation of the original event, meaning when that recording was made, and we're going to pretend like this recording was made in like a jazz club or a blues bar or a symphonic, orchestra, symphony hall. So we're just going to pretend like it's a real musical space. If you went there, you would have the instruments themselves in front of you. And then all around you, would have all these reflections from those instruments. And that tells you that you're in a big, large room and you're listening to real live music. In your room with 2 speakers, those speakers don't do that. Now, some of you are probably saying, but wait a minute, Matt, I have 2 speakers in front of me. I go to a bar, I got a band in front of me. The band creates these sounds that cause the reverberations, don't the 2 speakers? They do, but it's very likely your room is significantly different and smaller than any space you would naturally listen to music in. So what happens when you get rid of all the reflections is that all that information your brain uses to know that it's in the live event is gone. So you want to have a little bit of it there. Not too much, because again, your room is typically much smaller than a real live event room would be. And so if you have too strong of a reverberation, the room sounds too small. And so we use absorption, diffusion, and reflections as a way of mimicking that. So with two-channel systems, you need to have a more lively room, basically, to recreate that. With a surround system, you can actually get rid of a lot of the reflections and replace it with discrete sources that create the reverberation. Those discrete sources are the surround speakers. So as an example, the Dolby Up mixer with well-recorded two-channel music can actually create the same kind of envelopment you would get in a live event, and it actually does so much more accurately than two speakers does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had excellent results using the Dolby Up mixer, even on two-channel stuff. And I would say that in most people's rooms, I don't, I would assume, at least this is what I do, I would assume you're going to do two-channel listening, but you're also going to do multi-channel. So you have to pick a happy median in how you handle your room acoustics. You don't want the room too lively, and you don't want the room too dead. So
Yeah.
You want to be able to accommodate whether you're playing 2 speakers or 11 speakers, basically.
And there's different things you can do for that. You and I were going back and forth about this before the video, and I was mentioning kind of what I set up in my space versus what I do in practice, like what I intended to do when I did that versus what I do in practice, which comes more from laziness. But I think that having some adjustability in the acoustics is a good idea. I also think hitting sort of a target RT60 time that's sort of in the middle. And I know some people who are more knowledgeable are going to hear me talk about this and say, but Matt, I thought that RT60 doesn't matter for small rooms. It's inaccurate. The measurement of RT60 is perfectly accurate in small rooms. The theory and the mathematical model for RT60 is inaccurate in small rooms and shouldn't be used. So
let me ask you, for someone that doesn't have the ability to measure RT60 or even understand it, I try to look for practical solutions. You know how we have the subwoofer crawl, the law of reciprocity to figure out where to put a subwoofer? Okay, so using that same principle, this has worked for me. If you stand where that speaker is, or have somebody stand where that speaker is, and then you sit in your primary listening seat, have them clap their hands. If you hear slap echo, then you know where that needs to be treated to eliminate, because you want to eliminate the slap echo that's coming to the listening area, not necessarily any other location in the room that you don't care about. So I think it's a good trick that you basically stand a person near each of the main speakers, at least the front 3 speakers, let them clap their hands, and then you figure out what kind of absorption or diffusion you need on the sidewalls or on the ceiling to reduce that effect at the listening area. Would you say that that's a decent way of determining, without being able to measure, what you need to do in a room to make it sound better?
Yeah, absolutely. The only warning I would give is that people tend to walk around a room slapping their hands, and then anytime they hear slap echo, they think they need to treat it. What you said is actually really important. What matters is the slap echo you hear, where the speaker is located and where the listener are. So what I recommend is that you actually stand where you're going to sit. Really, you should sit where you're going to sit so your head is at the right height. And then you have somebody else clap their hands where the speakers are going to go. And even then, a little bit of slap echo is okay. Totally eliminating that often lowers the decay. It makes the reverberation level too low. And so it's okay, right? What we were saying earlier, you want a little bit of this reverberation. That's what gives you that room feel. So you want it to be comfortable. You don't want it to be overly loud. And what you said is right. The other thing I'll mention is slapping your hands together. Clapping them is fine. Professionals for years used to use a balloon. It's not used as much anymore, but you pop a balloon. It's not used as much anymore because when you pop a balloon, 3 different people, let's say, do it at 3 different times, could actually pop the balloon differently. They blow it up a different amount. But for an average person using just their ears, you can pop a balloon. And the nice thing about that versus clapping your hands is it's a bigger impulse. And so that actually gets the lower frequencies as well. So yes, clapping your hands is good. It's cheap and easy. But you can also go to the dollar store, buy a bag of balloons, blow them up, hit them with a pin. You got kids, they probably think it's the funnest thing they've ever done. And the nice thing for treating the room is that happens to be a better impulse source than clapping your hands.
There you go, guys. You have now an easy way, a cheap way, and a fun way to do some countermeasures in your room, to do troubleshooting, to figure out what kind of acoustic treatments you might need if you're unable to do RT60 or even interpret those results. This is a good swag way of doing it.
Yeah. You can clap wooden blocks together too.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, I've done that too. So I want to show, you guys this equation from one of our articles. Maybe you can kind of take a look at this for anybody that's a propeller head that wants to do some math. And then I want to talk a little bit more about bass. And then I think we'll probably wrap this up because I think we could do more videos on this depending on how popular this gets. But I was just thinking about this article the other day. I just ran into it. I was like, you know what? I want to kind of touch base with this. We got two or three great articles about room reflections and early reflections. We've got one article written by Dr. Floyd Toole, which I'll link up here. I think everybody should read this. This is a great article, a lot of good information in here, all based on his research over decades of research. I mean, this is just, if you don't have his book on sound reproduction, you should get it. And then we also have another person that used to work for Audioholics, Jeff Szymanski. This guy is very knowledgeable on acoustics. He wrote an article about early reflections in home theater, whether they're beneficial or detrimental, back when it became a controversy when Floyd first published his book about early reflections. So, and there's a very balanced approach here of what he talks about, kind of what we're saying now. But this little equation thing here kind of stuck with me. I was like, I never seen this before. And I was like, this is kind of cool for someone that wants to kind of figure stuff out. Matt, have you seen this before? And if you have, explain it. And do you think it's useful for people to help figure out what's going on in their room?
So basically what this formula is getting at has to do with the notion of early decay time. So it's the idea that you want to have a gap between the initial impulse you get from the speaker, the direct sound, and those reflections. If they're too close together, your brain interprets them as just one sound. And even though in time they're close together, if they're actually coming from a lot of different directions, that can cause some negative effects on the sound stage. So we can use reflections, diffusion, and absorption as a way of helping to extend that decay time, which makes the room basically sound bigger. And that's what we want. Because like I said, most people's rooms are substantially smaller than even the smallest performance spaces you would go into. So your room's natural acoustics doesn't match the acoustics of the space it's trying to recreate.
Right. So let me ask you a stupid question. Let me play devil's advocate here. What's the difference between absorption and diffusion?
So I think diffusion is one of the most misunderstood topics in acoustics. Now, the obvious difference between the two is that absorption takes the sound wave, it takes that energy, and through friction, it converts it to heat. And so that energy now, the acoustic part of it is gone. So if you think of the idea of physics, energy can't be created or destroyed, right? So when the sound wave is created, that energy is put into the room. It changed form, it was electrical and then mechanical, and now it's in the room. And when you convert it back to heat, the acoustic part of it is gone. The energy is still there. The room got a little bit warmer, but the sound is gone, right? So that's obvious. Diffusion does the same thing in a different way. It doesn't convert it to heat. It leaves all the energy in the room as acoustic energy. So the sound energy is there, but it breaks it up basically into lots of little rays of sound, smaller energy packets. And then because it's sending it off in different directions all over the place, those little rays of energy that hit your ear are much smaller in level than the total wave was originally. So instead of having a really strong reflection from the wall hitting your ear, you've got a much weaker one. But the reverberation in the room doesn't change because the total sound energy has remained the same.
Gotcha. So rule of thumb for people, if you're in a theater room, let's say it's a rectangle and you're doing a 7.1 system. So you got at least 7 speakers, maybe you have Atmos, maybe you have 4 speakers in the ceiling. You got an 11 channel system.
Mm-hmm.
What are some rules of thumb, knowing that these people are going to listen to some 2-channel music, mostly multi-channel, in terms of the front wall versus the side walls versus the ceiling? What, and versus the back wall where you're sitting, the seats are. What can you say are some rules of thumb for doing treatments on that quickly? Because we're going to do a separate video on this, but we want to give them a little tease on some rules of thumb when we wrap this up.
Sure. So generally, I like to treat that front wall behind the speakers with a lot of absorption. The
whole wall or just parts of the wall?
It depends. I like to treat the whole wall, but it depends on the person and their living.
And you have a screen to contend with, which is a reflector.
It is. So in my own theater, I use an acoustically transparent screen. And 100% of my front wall is treated 2 inches thick to 4 inches thick, depending on the part, with absorption. And then there is some membranes that were added to add some reflection in key places in a pattern. So called an MLS, or maximum length sequence pattern. And the first 3 feet of the sidewalls and all of the ceiling was treated behind the speakers and above the speakers. So one of my rules is that I think it's a good idea to treat around the speaker like that. It absorbs a lot of the sound that radiates, especially at lower frequencies, around the speaker and out. And it helps get rid of some of the interferences that can happen there. Now, is that really critical? I think that an untreated room can sound very good too. So I think it's a good idea to do it, but I don't want people to like kill themselves doing this. I personally think that if you have really good speakers and they're not too close to the wall, you should not treat the sidewalls. But if you have speakers that need to be within a foot or so of the wall, or maybe because you read our review and you saw our measurements and they suggested that the off-axis response was not so perfect, I think it could be a good idea to absorb that.
And
so
the
then
reason why you're saying that is because that speaker being so close to the wall is going to create a very prominent reflection.
Yes, exactly. That reflection will be very strong. And what it does acoustically is it creates what's called an acoustic mirror, or a second source. Basically, whatever distance the speaker is from the wall, there's now another fake speaker that's that distance opposite, like through your wall, kind of like a mirror would do.
Almost like a comb filtering effect you're going to get at your listening area, right?
Right. They interfere with each other. And there's arguments about how audible it is, but I think that the most prominent issue that comes out of that is it tends to smear the soundstage. And I know Floyd Toole would say, oh, well, we did research and it showed the effect wasn't that strong, but my experience is that it is audible and it's worth treating.
Yeah. And like you said, it depends on how close the speakers are to the wall and the characteristics of the directivity of those speakers.
Exactly.
So what about the wall behind the listening area? Because I've seen some people recommend absorption. I've seen some people recommend diffusion.
Yeah, so if you put a lot of diffusion,
if
you put a lot of diffusion on the back wall, it tends to create a decorrelated reflection, it's referred to. It makes the room sound a lot bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends, again, on the room. If you have a really, really long room and you sit very far from it, I would say a little absorption is probably a good idea. I wouldn't diffuse personally, even though that's done in studios. It's done in studios for different reasons that I don't think apply in a home environment. If the wall is, if you're still, let's say, at least 6 feet from the wall, but it's not such a big room, diffusion isn't a bad idea for helping the room sound bigger, while
especially when you have a lot of speakers in that such a small enclosed area.
Yeah. Now, if you're sitting up against the back wall, you should put a lot of absorption on it. And the reason is because your head is basically getting that second source heavily delayed. You get the direct sound, and then I should say it's not heavily delayed. You get the direct sound, and then you immediately get that rear wall reflection.
And we never recommend, if you could avoid it, don't sit against the back wall, because you're getting a lot of reflections, like Matthew's saying, but you're in a pressure maximum of the room. So you're getting a lot of bass. So no matter whether you use multi-sub or not, you're not going to get a lot of help when you're up against the back of that wall.
It's a bad location. It should be avoided. But if somebody has to do it, the best trick I can say is try to get yourself 4 inches of space so that you can stick a nice 4-inch, or ideally even a 6-inch panel on that wall to absorb a lot of that sound. You would want, like, a bass trap would be great, because it could get rid of some of that bass buildup you're getting being in that pressure maximum. But ideally, the absorber helps that wall not sound like it's right next to your head like that. You should not use diffusion. I'll just say that. You should never sit right next to a diffuser. It causes a phasey sound, basically. It's acoustically not good. I know people who do it and think it's great. I don't know what to tell you. I think there's something wrong with your hearing.
I got you. So last thing about the ceiling now. We didn't really talk too much about ceilings. My viewpoint on the ceiling is, if you do any treatments at all, then at the front of the room, you want to maybe do some absorption where the first reflection point is, and towards the back of the room is where you want to do the diffusion, especially if you have only 8-foot ceilings. You want to create a larger listening space.
Yeah. So here's where I might differ a little, but I'll just say I'm realistic, and I get that people typically can't treat their ceilings. If you can't treat your ceilings, treat your floor and whatever, like carpet, it's fine. But I've measured a lot of rooms, at this point, hundreds of rooms. And there's something that I've noticed. When a room has an acoustic false ceiling, which is those ceiling tiles, basically, the ones that have the funky texture and are made out of a material that's kind of fibery, there is significantly less modal problems. And I also find the rooms sound really good. So why would that be? Because the ceiling is basically a giant bass trap.
Mm.
So when I first started noticing that, I actually was talking to David Greisinger from Lexicon, and he said, "Oh yeah, false ceilings are great. They're like all acousticians know that. They're the greatest thing ever." And I was like, "Really? I wouldn't have thought that." So I started investigating at the time that I was noticing it, and what I found is he's right. They are really great acoustically. And so first off, if you have one, good for you, and there's some neat tricks you can do to enhance them even more. If you are debating between a drywall ceiling and an acoustics, the false ceiling, and you're wondering which is better, purely from a sound standpoint, that acoustic ceiling is actually probably better. So what do you do if you have a drywall ceiling, like I do and most people do? Treat the whole thing. Like the reality is, if you put a big panel on the ceiling like that, especially if you do it right, like bass traps, it gets rid of the vertical modes, and the measurements are better. Now, I get it. Who's going to do that? It's expensive. It's difficult. And how big of an effect does it have on sound? Well, my experience, to be honest, is that as much as that makes the measurements look better, I can make just as good sounding rooms without treating the ceiling that heavily. And that, as we've said many, many times, the multi-sub approach is still a much more significant way of fixing those bass problems than adding 1,000 bass traps to the ceiling.
It always is, because below 80 hertz, you have a lot of control of what you can do in that room with bass. You have to think of multiple subs as an active bass trap.
It is. It's
Especially
the best way to think of it.
Yeah, when you have DSP and everything. So multiple subs in a room will basically tell you you don't need to put a lot of giant bulky bass traps to treat problems in the modal regions that are usually 25 to 40 hertz. You can mostly take care of that with multi-sub, especially if you're not in a whole concrete room and you've got some mass in the room and you've got some flexibility in the room, and all the walls aren't infinitely rigid. Then multi-subs work really well to lower your need to do low frequency bass trapping.
Yeah, bass traps really, even the ceiling bass trap idea that I was talking about, are really most effective at dealing with the stuff that's more between around 80 hertz and 250, 300 hertz.
Which multi-sub won't address.
Exactly. So everything below 80 hertz where the multi-sub works, the reality is the bass trap, you would need so many of them, and they would have to be so large that they don't tend to be very effective. And I know that there's companies who are going to say, no, my bass trap was measured and it showed that it had still some absorption down to like 50 hertz. And I get it, but I'm just saying, I've installed a lot of bass traps in people's rooms. I've filled every corner, the ceiling, you name it. And it didn't make anywhere near as big a difference as 4 subs did.
Not only that, it's less efficient because now you're converting all that energy to heat.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the room gets a little warmer.
I'm just thinking from a sound standpoint, you're reducing sound power in the room.
A little bit, yeah.
So I think that's a good overview. We have a lot more stuff we could be talking about. We have bullet points here that are like 3 or 4 pages long, but we get complaints that these videos get too long, and it's already at 38 minutes. So I think, Matt, what we'll do is we'll have people down below ask questions. They could say, you guys could vote on what topic you want covered next in acoustics. This guy, Matthew, lives and breathes acoustics like I do when it comes to amplifier power measurements or speaker cables. So we've got the right guy here to do acoustic stuff. You show that there's a demand for these kind of videos. Like these videos, thumb them up, share them. If the views are up on these videos, we will do a series of acoustics videos. We'll go further into each topic that we talked about today. This is just kind of an overview. I think we could go a lot deeper, but I want to make sure there's a demand on YouTube for it first. What do you say about that, Matt? I'm volunteering you for more work.
I like talking about acoustics. I think that it's something that, as we've talked about before, is not super well understood. There's a lot of confusing information out there on the web, a lot of people saying different things. So I think that if there really is an interest, I always question how much other people care about this, but if there really is an interest for any of these topics, I'm happy to try to clarify and provide some guidance for everybody.
Okay. Well, we will monitor this over the next couple of weeks. And Matthew, again, I thank you for being here tonight to take time to do this. It's much needed. I will link up those two articles I was referencing, one from Dr. Floyd Toole and the other one from Jeff Zemansky. And you guys could do some more reading on your own. So the next time we go online, we could go even deeper into these topics after you have some good reference material. So guys, again, if you like this video, please thumb it up. Make sure you join our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. You get our content sooner over there than you do on here. You could actually suggest topics for us to discuss. There's a lot of benefits of being a patron. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. And until next time, keep listening.